for coming, everyone. I think I know most of you, but if I don't, I'm Kyle Manley. I'm back here in Earth Lab through Series. I'm working with Jennifer and also working with Laura D in the bio department. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my PhD work and then some of the related work I'll be doing here with Jennifer and Laura. And it's all related to innovating some approaches to better understand the impact of climate change on cultural ecosystem services. So,
do you want to just hit OK on that?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No worries. Ooh. Sure. It's like on top of. Let's see.
I just didn't want it to just ruin all your nice slides.
It's not like letting.
Oh,
Don't go.
I'll send you it.
Just like what's under it.
Hey, you can't pull it aside either. Well, if it doesn't bother, it's actually not showing up online.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really know how to fix that.
Don't show. Okay, don't show something. This again.
Yeah, I can't click on it.
They just can't click it.
Yeah. It'll just click on the slide itself. I don't know. Does anybody know how to deal with that?
So if you exit your presenter mode and then do it, maybe?
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yes, there you go.
Oh, smart.
You might need to hide the floating meeting panel again.
Okay.
Oh, wait, no, it looks like it's
Yeah.
good.
Okay, wait.
Just go present. Yeah, you got it.
Yay.
Yay.
Looks good.
I gotta
Yeah.
share again. Okay. Cool. Okay, so what are ecosystem services? So they're just the benefits that we receive from ecosystems. They were sort of mainstreamed in 2005 from a UN report called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And really the point was that we weren't acknowledging our societal dependence on ecosystems. And so we wanted to translate a lot of the work that's being done on ecosystem processes and functions and translate that into human well-being impacts from those processes and functions. And so that assessment classified services into 4 classifications: provisioning, which are like the material and energy outputs of ecosystems. These are what we think of services, but they go a lot beyond that. To regulating services that maintain the conditions sort of conducive for our lives and our thriving. Supporting services, which underpin a lot of the other ecosystem services. These are kind of controversial now and been kicked out more recently within new frameworks, but that's not super important. And then cultural services, which are the non-material benefits from ecosystems, which is what I focus on. And so we know these services don't just deliver these basic materials that we need, like we used to think, but they underpin a lot of different constituents of our well-being, things like our security, our health, our social relations, and even our freedom of choice and action. And so because of that, it's been, this ecosystem service framework's been adopted a lot more and more recently in policies, both global and national. So a couple of years ago, the UN adopted a statistical standard for accounting for ecosystem services across member countries, and that's been being adopted more and more within these countries recently. In 2012, EDS was formed, which is essentially just the IPCC for biodiversity and ecosystem services. And they work on a lot of different policy support and knowledge building efforts across the world. And then here nationally, last year, the White House developed some recommendations for accounting for ecosystem services. And then this year, they directed guidelines for our land management agencies to actually implement those accounting frameworks into their cost benefit analysis. And this is really important, obviously, because we know that ecosystems are being degraded rapidly right now. And 2019 global EDS report was looking at 18 ecosystem services, and they found that there's good evidence that 14 of those 18 services are in decline since 1970. But one of the major issues right now with studying these services is, if you look in this far right column, the indicators they use for a lot of these services are all biophysical indicators. This has been a common issue in the ecosystem service field in general. is that the whole point of the ecosystem service framework is that we want the social aspects. There's a lot of work already being done on these biophysical things. And so people have been struggling to translate that biophysical to the social and connecting those interdependencies. And so we need to have a more social ecological approach to these assessments. And so this is especially important because we know climate change, it impacts human systems, it impacts ecosystems. There's a lot of work on this, but there's a lot less focus on these interconnections and dependencies that we have on ecosystems and how, when climate change affects an ecosystem, how do those impacts compound into impacts to human well-being? And that's especially the case for cultural services because they are a lot less material. They're a lot more subjective and context dependent. And so again, these are the non-material benefits we receive from ecosystems, things like recreation, aesthetic appreciation, spiritual values, things like that. And so there's a really good quote I like that I think explains it pretty well. They're not a priori products of nature that people utilize for a particular benefit for well-being. Rather, they're more of a relational process that we actively create and express through interactions with ecosystems. So it's less of a means to an end and more of just the means itself that is the service. And so cultural services can benefit us individually through physical and mental health, cultural, spiritual, religious benefits, and things like fulfillment and sense of place. There's also a lot of larger scale benefits through things like economic and development benefits. And also cultural services are commonly used to justify and plan environmental protection because they are publicly perceived and people really value these things. So they can help us protect land. But again, these are the least studied ecosystem service, and that's mainly because they are so subjective and complex. And so they inherently lack theory or a universal framework where it works in one context, you can't just apply it to another context. Everything's context dependent in cultural services. And so that limits our understanding of the social ecological drivers of these services. And that's mainly due to the fact that we don't have data and methods that can really capture this at large scales that we need to understand these services. And so here is a ecosystem service framework I adapted for cultural services. And so the idea really is that there's this beneficiary group that gains some dimension of human well-being, which flows from the service itself. And it's produced by interacting social and ecological factors, which are driven by governance and management of landscapes. That ideally loops back to beneficiary groups as their perceptions and responses affect governance and management. But if I highlight here where the historical bottleneck to studying cultural services has been, so we don't have data or methods really that have been able to help us assess how interacting social and ecological factors produce cultural services in the first place. And so what we did is we looked at some new tools we thought had a lot of potential to overcome those limitations for studying cultural services, one being these large data sources that are increasing in size every year, especially social sensing data, which is like sensing or data of people or their phones or applications, things like social media, citizen science projects, and mobile phone data. And this gives us the advantage of having that social side of ecosystem services, and it also gives us a lot of more global availability of this data, so we can scale these assessments. The other tool was machine learning, which can help us address data availability issues through being able to handle big data I was just talking about, or handle situations where there's a lack of data more robustly than our traditional methods could in the ecosystem service field. Also, the data-driven aspects are really good for cultural ecosystem services because of that inherent lack of any theory there. We can just look at what's going on within the data itself and figure out what's driving cultural services in the first place. So we started with a literature review, looking at how these tools were being used in the ecosystem service field in general. And what we found was their use is increasing more recently, but more interestingly, they're being used mostly to study cultural services, which is the opposite of the general trend in the field. And so that tells us that these tools do have some use and overcoming limitations to studying these services. Then if we look at the gaps that are being used to study cultural services specifically, they're overcoming a lot of data availability issues, which we thought was pretty obvious there. And then they're helping us study both the social and ecological sides of cultural services, which is what we need to do, study these. And finally, if we look at where these studies are occurring, mainly in China and Western Europe, this is pretty representative of the field in general. So these tools aren't being used to their full potential and to study ecosystem services in these regions where we don't have any data or any understanding of ecosystem services in the first place, places like Africa. So what we wanted to do was just test a new approach to studying cultural services in a test case in California of recreation. And so we use social sensing data, we use Flickr data, which is an image sharing social media website, kind of like Instagram, but it's more popular among outdoorsy people. We use it because it's available across large spatial scales. So what we do in this project can essentially be done in a lot of different regions across the world. And it's been previously validated and it represents recreation patterns really well in global protected areas. So we just download our data for California and we're looking at a 13-year period for just the peak recreation season, so the summer, and then you reduce bias by just keeping one unique upload per user per day. And so what you can see is when we aggregate that to just a grid across California, you can pull out these patterns and you can imagine the high spatiotemporal availability of this data. You can really pull out high resolution patterns of where people are visiting. And we leave out urban areas because the dynamics are a lot different in there. Then we can just validate this by looking at the correlation between actual MPS visitation data. We see high correlation there. And so again, you can imagine a lot of land managers are interested in this because all these different agencies collect visitation data differently. It's really hard to compare this, but if you have one sort of standardized way to look at visitation across these, subjective boundaries, it's a lot easier to look at what's driving visitation, look at these different issues with visitation across these different agencies that manage these lands. So what we do is then look just at how summer recreation is differing from the annual patterns, so essentially where are people recreating in summer. We're seeing a lot more recreation in the Sierras, and northern and central and coastal California, a lot less recreation in southern and the desert regions of California. And so you can already tell climate's playing a big role in driving these patterns. But to explicitly look at that, we're using random forest. And we use it because it can model these complex interactions among a lot of different predictor variables. So we can test a lot of different variables, see what's driving these patterns. And it's been used in ecology a lot. So a lot of our work, we wanted to be able to just implement within the ecosystem service field easily. So this is a familiar algorithm within the field. And we can get some insights into what's going on in the model through things like variable importance calculations. And so what we see is that these recreation patterns are really being driven by social and ecological factors. So things like infrastructure, trails and highways, as well as climate, like max temperature. If we look a little more detail at what's going on, you can see as trail density increases, you're seeing a much greater increase in visitation. As you get further from highways, you see a rapid decrease in visitation. So managers can use these things to push visitation and cultural services to places that they want. Also, interestingly, if you look at max temperature in detail, you're seeing sort of like a threshold of about 25 degrees Celsius where visitation rapidly decreases. And this was pretty cool because there's a lot of physiology literature where people are reporting that around 25 degrees Celsius, they don't really want to be outside doing anything physical. It's kind of interesting that within our data and our model, we can sort of pull that effect out. So then we just use the model to predict in the future under different warming scenarios, how suitability essentially will change for these cultural services across California. And really what you're seeing is just a magnification of the current peak season recreational patterns. So current areas that are popular now will become more suitable in the future. Areas that aren't popular in the summer are going to become less suitable. And so you sort of have this like shrinking area that's already popular. That's just going to become more suitable. And so we already know there's a lot of issues with over visitation in these areas. And there's ecological implications of that. There's also implications of declining like value of that cultural service when you have a lot of crowding. So these are just models you can sort of think of that managers have a lot of use for in planning for the future. So what we want to do then, ultimately what we really want to do with this data and these tools was use them to look at cultural services in understudied regions of the world, because that's sort of one of the big pros of this data, that it's globally available. So we implemented those methods in Africa to look at cultural services across the whole continent. And so this time we're using eBird as a proxy for cultural services. It can be thought of as like bird-related cultural services, but also there's evidence that bird species richness is sort of an indicator of biodiversity-based tourism and recreation in general. So sort of looking at just biodiversity-based cultural services in general. And so eBird is a citizen science project. It's commonly pretty much always used for its insights on the birds themselves. But we're sort of flipping that on its head and using it as an indicator of the birders and where they're going and where they're at and when they're there. And so as of 2022, it had over 1 billion observations from over 820,000 unique users. So for our data set, we take a 10-year period and we end up, after cleaning, about 151,000 unique user days across the entire continent from over 9,000 users. So again, you can see we can really garner these large-scale insights that were essentially impossible to see at these scales in a lot of these countries where there's not data available and this kind of data available. But using this data set, we can really find these hotspots across Africa that are providing a lot of cultural services to people, like in Morocco, around like Victoria and the Okavango Delta, these biodiversity hotspots in South Africa. And then this time to model the social ecological relationships that are driving those patterns, we use maximum entropy modeling, which is, again, pretty common in the ecology field. It's usually used for species distribution models, but we can actually use that to study sort of the niche for cultural services, or for people's niche for cultural services, I guess you can think of it that way. And we use it mainly because it's more conducive to modeling these uncertainties regarding cultural service use and demand, because it's not modeling exact numbers of visitation, it's more modeling the suitability of the landscape to provide cultural services to people based on social ecological relationships. So again, we can look at what's driving these factors. Sorry, I'm gonna look. It's a chat.
Oh, it's just a question for when you're done.
Okay.
Yeah, no worries.
Just wanted to make sure.
Thank you.
We can look at what's driving these patterns again. And again, it's a mixture and interactions among biodiversity, infrastructure, climate. The most important variable being bird species richness, which is somewhat interesting because there's been some work looking at what's driving bird-related tourism. It's usually threatened species richness or rarity. But bird species richness in general always came out on top in our model. It's probably just the scale we're looking at. And so again, that shows you the context dependency of looking at cultural services in general. We also see infrastructure again is important. As you get further from protected areas, or areas become less accessible, you're seeing a lot less cultural service use. And we're again pulling out that threshold effect from max temperature, which is interesting. And so I ran these models for every major biome in Africa to demonstrate that context dependency and sort of show you how managers can think about this in the context they want. So as your question changes, you'll have to think about modeling and cultural services differently. So for example, in these biomes, most of the major drivers across the whole continent stay relatively important, but You pull out some interesting things like biodiversity intactness becomes the most important variable driving cultural services in moist broadleaf forests in Africa. And so if you know anything about moist broadleaf forests in Africa, there's big deforestation issues right now. And we know that'll have ecological implications, but now we also can tell that that'll have impacts on cultural services and all the benefits that local people receive and tourists receive from those cultural services. So this is just what the model output looks like. So the dark green is where the model's correctly classifying cultural service presence. But more interestingly, the light green is where the model's classifying presence, but there is no data there. So either this is areas where we need more data, but it's more likely areas where there's suitability for cultural services, but they just aren't there for one reason or another. People aren't going to these regions. And so if somebody wants to increase cultural services, increase tourism, increase local economic impacts from tourism, you can sort of use this model in a context dependent and a local scale and see where you could increase your cultural services potentially. And that's just the overall suitability across the entire continent. You can really see sort of these large scale provision of cultural services across the whole of Africa. And there's clearly a lot of opportunity to provide these services to people across the continent, and it demonstrates sort of the importance of these non-material benefits that we receive from ecosystems and providing things like well-being to people, sustainable economic development, and also achieving conservation goals. And they all sort of are in line with each other in a lot of these regions. And then finally, we model the suitability in the future as the climate changes. And again, we're seeing a lot of decreases in suitability in the future, especially in these regions where there's current high use of cultural services like Southern Africa, Eastern Africa. And if we aggregate that to each country, again, the average suitability increase or decrease, we're mainly seeing decreases across most of these countries under most scenarios for the suitability of cultural service flows to people. But if you look at this in a different way, like the vulnerability, so where there's current cultural service use, where is it decreasing past some threshold where we could consider it unsuitable, or where people might not partake in these cultural services as much, and just aggregate that to each country, you're again seeing a lot of vulnerability, especially in these high cultural service producing areas. And so that tells us, you know, if we want to sustain a lot of these benefits, so for example, 10 to 12% annual growth rate in African tourism right now, I think that was pre-COVID actually, but there's about $48 billion in tourist spending across African protected areas. If you want to maintain those benefits, you sort of have to look at these vulnerable regions. And this is one way that we can pull out where people are going and what's vulnerable. And then finally, because our models are including a lot of different variables in the future, so climate, biodiversity, land use, we want to pull out what's driving these changes. So one model we only run 5 variables changing. One, we're only changing biodiversity variables, and one, we're only changing land use. And what we see really is climate change is the main driver of these impacts, of these negative impacts on cultural services, with biodiversity change also playing a big role in certain countries. And then finally, for my last chapter, I was looking at seeing if we could use these tools for valuation. So ecosystem service valuation is a really important method in the field. And so the value of an ecosystem service sort of represents the ways in which individuals and societies express these goals, beliefs, and importance that they assign to nature. So a value quantifies non-market values, right? So they're not traded on traditional markets like that are affected by supply and demand. These are just things that we benefit from, and there's value there. And so it really represents this like utility or this welfare benefit to people and society as a whole. And that's sometimes expressed monetarily. And there's benefits to expressing it monetarily, like it translates well, obviously, to policy and decision makers. They like to see dollar signs. It works well in trade-off analyses between. So a lot of times when you make decisions, you're going to trade off between ecosystem service provisioning, and it depends on what you want. And valuing this monetarily helps to translate that. And it also is really helpful in raising awareness of the cost of environmental degradation. So it's essentially quantifying these externalities in our current makeup of our economy. So things like GDP are increasing because we're degrading the environment greatly, but we're not accounting for that degradation or those effects to people from that degradation. And so expressing that degradation monetarily from an ecosystem service framework can help people understand the impacts. So what we do is we use a revealed preference method, which measures ecosystem service preferences by measuring actual or observing actual beneficiary behavior. And the method we use is called the travel cost method, which measures use value of an ecosystem service essentially by just quantifying the cost of travel. So essentially saying the minimum amount people are willing to pay to get to an area to partake in a cultural service, that's at least what it's worth monetarily. And so again, we're using eBird data. This time we're only looking in South Africa, which is a global attraction for biodiversity-based tourism. And we end up with about 45,000 user days from our eBird data set from over 3,000 users. And what we can do with that is then approximate where each user is coming from. And we're only looking at their home country. So the way you do that is you take each unique user in your data set, you look across all eBird data and see where they're uploading the most with some minimum threshold of uploads. And you're just saying that's almost certainly where they're coming from. And that's been a validated method in the field. And so once we have where they're coming from, we can sort of calculate this travel cost or the travel cost, which is just the cost of travel plus the opportunity cost of time of that travel. And so for international users, what you're doing is you're taking the distance from a centroid of the country that's weighted by the population to the closest international airport to the first upload, and then you're multiplying that by the cost of air travel. And then similar thing for domestic users, but we're looking at the province that they're coming from. So we're taking the road distance from centroid of their province to their first upload of a certain trip they're taking. And then you're multiplying that by the cost of that travel. So the cost of gasoline and the cost of that travel. And then for the opportunity cost of time, it's typically thought of or quantified as 1/3 someone's wage rate. And so what we do is we take the average wage rate of either the country they're coming from or the province they're coming from for the month and year they're traveled, and multiplying that by the time it takes them to travel. So that's how you get this travel cost. And then adjust all calculations for inflation. And so again, what we do is we model this suitability across the landscape for cultural services, but this time we can look at the differences between international and domestic beneficiaries. We see similar patterns, but there are some differences. So for example, we're seeing higher suitability in these biodiversity hotspots for international beneficiaries like Kruger National Park and the Cape Floral Biodiversity Hotspot, and more suitability for domestic users in these highly populated regions, as you'd expect, like Gauteng and Cape Town. And again, we can look at sort of what's driving these differences. And so what we see is protected areas a lot more important for domestic beneficiaries, and whereas biodiversity in general is just more important for international beneficiaries. And we thought about this, and you can kind of think of this like in America, there's a lot of culturally iconic parks that are more important for us because they're sort of ingrained in our culture. Whereas when people visit, there's a lot more interest in just biodiversity in general, especially in South Africa. And so we also see that climate plays a greater relative role in driving international cultural service use. And so that tells us that there's probably a greater vulnerability of international tourism to future climate change in this region, at least. And so what we can do with those travel costs that we calculated earlier is just aggregate them to each province across South Africa. And we see really more concentrated areas of cultural service value for international beneficiaries or international tourists who seem to find more value in the Southwest and the Northeast, but for locals, that value of cultural service is a lot more uniform across the entire country. Then we can just calculate totals. This is just, so it's, I never know how to say this to people. This isn't like an actual economic benefit or anything, but it can help you compare things. And so just within our data set alone, the minimum willingness to pay to get to these cultural services in South Africa is about $14.7 million. And for locals, it's about $730,000. So really what we're seeing is international beneficiaries spend a lot more to get there, obviously, and they're staying for a lot longer. Whereas domestic beneficiaries are paying less, but they're taking a lot more trips. And so it's important to note that these two things aren't comparable. It doesn't mean international tourists value these things more. They're looking at different things essentially. So you can't really compare these values. But what you can do is you can look at how that social ecological suitability for cultural services across the landscape compares to that value that people receive. And we're seeing really high correlation between these things. And once you hit a certain threshold of suitability, as you increase in suitability, you're seeing a lot more value in these cultural services for both domestic and international ecosystem service beneficiaries. And so what that connection allows us to do is then just model the total value across the entire landscape. And again, we can see similar patterns with some regional differences in cultural service value for these different groups. And we can model that into the future and look at how cultural service value will be impacted by changing social and ecological factors. And as we expected, there is a bit more vulnerability to that value for international beneficiaries. You can see in Kruger National Park, which is the protected area with the highest cultural service value currently. You're seeing decreases for international cultural services, but increases for domestic. But if you look across most protected areas, for the most part, you're seeing decreases in cultural service value as climate change increases. And so we can quantify that. We're seeing about a 21% decrease in cultural service value for international tourists and an 18% decrease for domestic tourists. So that was a lot of my work during my PhD. And all of that was really focused on these chronic changes and how those impact cultural services. But that always brought up the question of how do these acute events then also factor into changing cultural services, and also how does adaptation affect cultural service use. So there was a recent literature review looking at climate change related environmental change impacts on cultural services. And for the most part, there's not a lot of work looking at any of this in general, but especially there's a lack of work looking at disturbance impacts, including wildfires. And so what we want to do is we want to see how patterns of cultural service use change under different wildfire scenarios across a broad scale. So how are they changing after wildfires, prescribed fires, and then comparable control non-burn areas? We also want to look at how prescribed fire mitigates the negative for wildfire on cultural service use at landscape scales, and see if there are disparities in exposure to wildfire hazards coming from the cultural service lens. And is there an uneven distribution of prescribed fire mitigation, again, coming from the cultural service lens? And what are the connections between these factors? And so again, we're going to use social sensing data, but we're going to use a mixture of data sets. So you can see a few data sets that we're going to use here in Colorado. And what we want to do is use statistical matching to select these comparable wildfire, prescribed fire, control non-burn areas, better control for these confounding factors. And then I can sort of give you an example of how this will work. So this is the Fern Lake fire in 2012 that burned through Rocky Mountain. And so what we'll do is we'll take a fire and we'll have these overlaying social sensing data sets. And so we'll aggregate the the social sensing data within the fire perimeter, as well as within like a buffer of trails that intersect that fire perimeter. And then what we can do is use their statistical relationships between these uploads to these different social sensing data sets, as well as use things that affect recreation like seasonality, temperature, precipitation, holidays, to actually model actual visitation numbers over time. And hopefully the idea is to pull out these general trends in visitation pre and post wildfire. So you can see here, this is initial run where we're seeing that gradual increase in visitation that we expect to see without any effects. Then after the disturbance, we're seeing a decrease in that visitation and a slow recovery. And so there was one similar study that did this, that looked at just the Eagle Creek fire in Oregon. And what they essentially wanted to do was look at these different sites within both the affected burn area and nearby regions or nearby recreational sites that weren't affected. What they wanted to see was how was recreation affected within the fire, and were people substituting areas outside the fire. And what they found was there was a lot of loss of visitation at these affected sites, as we'd expect, but there was a low substitution behavior to these nearby regions. So what we want to do is something similar, essentially, but do it at a large scale and get a broader picture of the disturbance impacts to these cultural services, rather than just look at a single event. And in that way, we can sort of look at these trade-offs between disturbance and management efforts. What does the impact to recreation look like? What does the recovery curve sort of look like? And can we pull out sort of vulnerable regions where maybe impact from disturbance affect recreation more than other regions? I'll get more into that later. And then we can pull out threshold effects, maybe looking at severity. Is there some sort of severity threshold where impacts to cultural services become more evident? And then finally, we also want to look at these shorter term impacts, smoke, how those impact recreation. So they can impact it in multiple ways. So they can either impact the visitation itself as people change their behavior, there's smoke outside, or what we think is going to happen is people aren't going to change their behavior. They're still going to recreate in the smoke, and that actually produces an ecosystem disservice. And so here's a study doing something similar with campsite data. And they found that there was some decreases in campsite people getting permits for campsites. But for the most part, people weren't changing their behavior, even in high smoke days. And there was another study recently that looked at this in national parks. And again, they pulled out that effect that essentially people aren't changing their behavior, even on high smoke days, they're still going to go out and recreate. And so what we want to do is get this large scale, pull out the large scale general trends of how smoke is affecting recreation in the US West. We'll look at sort of visitation modeling and attributable smoke polygons for prescribed fires and wildfires. And what we can pull out from that is sort of costs of smoke. So cost in either the lost recreation days and the subsequent lost cultural service value that people would have derived. But what we're thinking again that we'll see is most of the costs will be in health costs from exposure days. And something interesting that we think we'll pull out from this is that I think there's going to be differences in behavior depending on the attributes of the underlying landscape. So for example, so national parks are a bit more iconic. People are traveling longer distances to national parks. So they're probably a lot less willing to change their behavior. They're going to see a lot more of those ecosystem disservices, whereas local popular spots, like I think national forests are visited more by local people. You're going to see more of a behavioral change, and we're probably going to pull out more of a cost of lost recreation days from those areas. So that's just something interesting that we can pull out from this analysis. But ultimately, what we want to do is just get a better idea of this less understood but major component of climate-induced risk to people. So looking at risk through this cultural ecosystem service lens and creating sort of a more holistic understanding of what climate change risk even means through this ecosystem service lens. But as we know, ecological and social connections exist, and so coming at risk from a social ecological perspective. Yeah, so that's it.
Take some questions.
A quick question about like the maxent distribution modeling you did.
Mhm.
So the map of Africa,
Mhm.
the two things that jumped out to me immediately were the low numbers in Somalia and Congo. So how is your model is or is not taking into account things like political instability?
Yeah, that's something we always thought about, and it is not accounting for that, but it's something that, well, in some ways it does. We use like GDP and the Human Development Index, which can somewhat account for
Yeah.
that, but it'd be better to explicitly account for that. And we had a hard time finding data that can represent that well across large scales. So we thought Human Development Index was our best bet.
That sounds really cool.
But it is an interesting question, and there is some work looking at how like conflict affects cultural services.
Yeah, especially because like the way you broke it up in that map, you had like potential areas basically.
Yeah.
And like that's probably underrepresented in like those two areas because like I said, you accounted for someone and your training data definitely accounts for it, right?
Definitely.
Like, yeah, being able to pull out more like what could be here for what
Right.
were constant wars.
Right, exactly, yeah, and so we were, sort of the framing of it is just climate, environmental, and like infrastructure in general. If we just account for that, where is it suitable? And then, as you could see in like DRC, it's becoming more suitable in the future actually, but that's not accounting for political and other social factors that are also important, and also disturbance as well.
I think Kaylee had a similar question on the chat. Want me to read it, or do you wanna? It's kind of long.
Sure, I can chat if people.
Could you read it? I can't really find it.
Okay, for the social sensing data, how do they validate it internationally? For example, there are different ideas of recreation and nature between Japan, South Africa, and the US, and who has access to completing a survey. I'm curious how complete the social sensing data is and your future hopes in addressing those sorts of gaps. This is super interesting research. I'm thinking of applications for countries that are and will continue to be especially affected by climate change.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a lot of work right now that's going on, looking at sort of the demographics of different social sensing data sets and how they don't necessarily match up with who's actually out in nature. And that's sort of to be expected. And so it's sort of the question people are asking right now. And how do we weight different sensing data sets based on demographics? So it's hard to do right now. There are like more popular social media websites, depending on what you're looking at or where you're looking. And so you can sort of account for that in that way and using just a multitude of different data sets, which is what we're trying to do. But also, yeah, there's a lot of work currently ongoing, seeing how we can sort of statistically manipulate the data to better represent the actual people, because it's never going to be overall representative of the groups that are out there.
Yeah, thanks. Super interesting talks. I was fascinated by your work on Africa. I guess that you're moving on now.
Yeah.
Well, a lot into that. With that, I was just curious if you knew of the BII index, the Biodiversity Index Index. So maybe it would have been good or cool to compare it, how it would be, because there's one specifically for Africa that was developed.
Okay.
So that could be maybe another, even more, because it's more holistic approach that only eBird that only allows by 30 people. So it would include big mammals and all these things. So maybe it would be a cool approach if you get over to reduce any analysis in that aspect. But but on your current research, I found it fascinating. I think it's much needed so that we know what are the social impacts of wildfires, but also the management implications that we are doing. So because it's a lot of shifting towards prevention, but those are having consequences. So I think that your research is gonna shed a lot of light on that. I was wondering though, whether you are considering within the different management applications, if there is any sort of covariate that you could include in the level of sensibilization that they do to the local community. I don't even know, I'm not very familiar with to what extent that's going on here in the States,
Yeah.
because, but I know that in many places there's special conservation units or national parks that are, oh, here is an area that we are managing with fire, and look at the flowers, and look at they are promoting sensibilizations or campaigns on that.
Mhm.
So it would be maybe interesting to compare different degrees of that.
Yeah, so you're saying like the social acceptance of these management?
I was wondering whether that could be, if you were considering including maybe as a covariate or comparing.
No, it's so, I haven't been considering that. I think it's an interesting idea. I think the ultimate goal was sort of to show that prescribed fires do have these benefits, especially even from a cultural service perspective, and sort of improving the social license to burn from that perspective. So I was thinking more as an end impact, but it is interesting to bring it into the actual analysis itself.
Yeah.
See if there's some data, like even like Lise does with Twitter data, if we could pull that out,
Yeah.
it'd be an interesting, there's a lot of interesting questions, and that's something I'll think about for sure.
Yeah, I'm not really sure here. I know that, for instance, some conservation units in California and other places in the world, they do like special campaigns, those do sensibilization in the community that they look, we are doing and things, and that I was wondering what would be, with your research, it would be really cool to see if that has a perceived benefit or visitation increases.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
I'll keep, thank you for that suggestion. That's cool. I like that.
So I thank you for your presentation, and I have a question about your future work plans. So about the smoke and the cultural ecosystem services, I'm wondering if you consider smoke movement over distances. For instance, wildfires and smokes can affect urban areas where many people are living, and urban residents mainly depend on their daily lives within the urban areas for their physical and mental health with urban parks or green spaces.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's a lot of the smoke work that's been done already is in urban areas. Just looking at exposure in general. And I think our idea was more bring that cultural service lens, and like you said, that exists in urban areas too. But I think the dynamics are so hard to pull out in urban areas because people are just uploading so many things everywhere. It's hard to pull out like what's an ecosystem service and what is just someone posting their dinner or something. So it's a hard thing to do right now. I think it'd be interesting to look at like urban green spaces, but for us, I think we're gonna be looking mostly in like federal protected lands and these like wilderness areas, because we're doing that statistical matching, and so I don't think we'll be bringing in any big parks right now, but I think it's an interesting thing to look at. It's just a lot harder to do. So we're going for the low hanging fruit at the moment.
That was fantastic, Kyle. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.